I'll turn it back over to my good friend from Texas.
My friend from Pennsylvania makes a great deal of sense, and I can't help but observe the utter hypocrisy of, with all due respect, so many of our colleagues on this side of the aisle in both the so-called upper chamber and the so-called People's House. How about the junior senator from Utah, Mitt Romney, when he said in 21, quote, "Democrats want to spend boatloads of money at the wrong time and in the wrong ways instead of addressing inflation and dealing with the emerging threat of China. They're dead set on raising taxes and government giveaways. This isn't how we solve the problems facing Americans," end quote. Well, the junior senator from Utah just supported this monstrosity, opposed, I believe, the senior senator from Utah in the election this year, the senior senator from Utah being the one who is trying to stop this monstrosity today. How about the exiting senior senator from Alabama in July of 2022, just this year? Inflation hit, quote, "Inflation hit 9.1% today, another record high. This is devastating news for millions of hardworking Americans. The Biden administration remains remiss in getting inflation under control. Passing another massive tax and spend bill would be a mistake we cannot afford," end quote. Well, here's the problem with Republicans, with all due respect to Republicans, is that they love to use the phrase tax and spend. But my Republican colleagues who oppose tax increases, which I generally do as well, sure have no problem with spend and spend. Spend for defense, spend for non-defense discretionary, and then go with their tail tucked between their legs back home and go, "I'm sorry, I couldn't really do anything about it. Our hands were tied because we must have the spending for defense and we must have the spending for Ukraine because somebody gave a fancy speech in this chamber last night."
Will the gentleman yield for a question? You were talking about its defense, and of course, as a citizen who's been honored to wear the uniform for over 3 decades, certainly the number one priority outlined in our Constitution is defending our nation and its citizens. When we talk about spending for defense, are we talking about spending for the defense of the United States? Or is there anybody else here that you'd like to discuss where we're spending on their defense?
Well, it's a great question that my friend raises. The omnibus spending bill that is coming over to us from the Senate, to the best of my understanding, raises defense spending somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 10%, right?
Is that what the president asked for?
It is more than what the president asked for, I believe.
President is the commander-in-chief, right?
Correct. But in addition to the increase in spending for our national defense, there is also an additional $45 billion, which is almost the entire budget of our Department of Homeland Security, by the way. $45 billion additional to go to Ukraine, on top of the almost $60 billion already approved, authorized this last year, bringing it to somewhere around $100 billion, again, for Ukraine, well eclipsing, almost doubling our own Department of Homeland Security budget, well eclipsing the entire defense budget of Russia. And American taxpayers are paying for that. And we talked about the, I think, 8 to 10% increase in defense spending. I'd have to look at my notes, a sizable pop of money. Is the gentleman in agreement? Because the gentleman served in the United States military for 30 years, and I thank him for it, just like I thank every other veteran and every other active duty member of our United States military for standing up to defend this country. But I don't think the gentleman did that in order to rack up more debt and to destroy our financial security. I don't think the gentleman did that in order to throw 10% more money to the Department of Defense, a Department of Defense which is continually more of a social engineering experiment wrapped in a uniform than it is a military design to kill people and blow things up. Would the gentleman agree?
I would agree with that. And I think that the gentleman from Texas would also agree. Look, neither of us like what Vladimir Putin or the country of Russia has done to its neighbor, Ukraine. Being a bully, invading, blowing up their buildings and their infrastructure, killing their citizens is unacceptable. It's unacceptable. We all know that, and we all want to help. At the same time, Our military is being destroyed by our own country, not some other country. We're not focused as an individual, a citizen who's been privileged and honored to serve in uniform. I can tell you, we're not focused on keeping our country safe. We're focused on a bunch of woke policies that are undermining the good order and discipline and the fighting spirit and the focus of our military. If we're spending money on the military, we need to spend money on our military. If we're spending money on the borders of Ukraine or Tunisia or Egypt, we certainly need to spend money on the borders of the United States of America, not just to process individuals coming across illegally. That's what we're doing. But actually to thwart those people coming illegally, and as importantly, the criminal element that's coming in, the cartel involvement, the human trafficking and smuggling, the fentanyl that's coming in and killing American citizens now, just reported at a record rate higher than the year before, which was at a record rate. What will it take? 4,100 pages? What will it take before we start concentrating on the citizens of the United States of America? No one raises their right hand in this chamber and takes an oath to defend Tunisia or Ukraine or any of these other countries. It's the United States of America, our Constitution, and our citizens. Not you.
I would just ask the gentleman from Pennsylvania, do you recall when the gentleman and myself came to the floor of the House right after the invasion of Ukraine by Putin, and we spoke right here at this table, and we spoke about the horrors being inflicted by the evil, and the evil being perpetrated by Vladimir Putin, the extent to which we were in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and wanting to stand up and defend their country against the thuggish behavior and the willful destruction of lives and the carnage that has been carried out by Vladimir Putin and the Russian army. Do you remember, does the gentleman remember, our being here on the floor talking about that in the early stages, wanting to stand up and support the people of Ukraine before this chamber embarked on a 9-month spending spree without any pay-fors and without any significant accountability or knowledge of how the dollars are flowing, and without any care and concern about what we're doing for our own sovereignty and security on the home front? Does the gentleman remember that?
Of course I do. Of course I remember.
And does the gentleman believe that it is possible for people who have concerns about these things, about the spending, about the ridiculous decision-making in this chamber, to want to stand up and be able to say that they stand with the people of Ukraine in solidarity, but don't believe that writing a blank check is in their interest, our interest, or anybody's interest?
That's exactly right. We all want to help, but you don't write a check that you can't afford. There's no money in your bank account to pay for somebody's house down the street while leaving your house unpaid for and your back door open, where you know criminals are going to be walking in and taking your children out and leaving life-threatening drugs on your kitchen table. You would not do that.
And so would the gentleman agree with me, and I wanted to lay that foundation about our shared desire to stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, whatever that means in terms of resources, that should be debated. And by the way, side note, have we ever had a full, robust debate with amendments and being able to offer any kind of discussion here about Ukraine on the floor of the House?
Have we had any debate?
On any matter whatsoever. So what I would inquire of the gentleman is, does he agree with this? That if you go back and look about what's going on, everything you are seeing unfold before your eyes, America, is a setup. It's a complete setup. You go back to September, and a block of us, about 42 of us, wrote a letter to the leaders of these august bodies saying, hey, how about not doing a continuing resolution into the middle of December right before Christmas? How about you not do that? Because we know exactly what that results in. We sent that letter. What happened in September? A continuing resolution right to the middle of December. Now you get to the continuing resolution in the middle of December. There's all sorts of chatter about, well, will there be a continuing resolution into early 2023 with a new House majority? Never in the last 70 years have we had a transfer in the majority of the House chamber and had the Senate do what it did today, which is jam through a massive spending bill with the existing House soon-to-be minority and jam it through. Now, Fast forward to right now, and what do you have? We have this bill sent to us that spends $1.7 trillion, a 10% increase in defense spending, $42 billion increase in non-defense spending, which is 6%, Ukraine funding of $45 billion, disaster relief funding of $40 billion, and $15 billion of earmarks that I went through and described a little bit ago. And who spoke in the chamber in the United States House of Representatives last night other than the president of Ukraine? Now, does the gentleman believe, as I do, that that's not an accident? That the entire setup from the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans, working with the Democrat leadership in both chambers, was to set that up so that you have the president of Ukraine speaking here saying we've got to pass this massive spending bill because you had the whole theatrical event set up from the beginning, set up to expire right before Christmas, to then jam through 7,200 earmarks, a massive amount of spending, continued explosion of the bureaucratic state, a restriction on the ability to secure the border, all because you knew you had a handful of Republicans on the hook who couldn't help themselves because we're talking about defense and we're talking about Ukraine. Does the gentleman think that maybe that stuff is not a coincidence?
Is the gentleman suggesting, even though we all know that we want to help, what's happening in Ukraine is objectionable, we disagree with every bit of it, what Russia's doing, but is the gentleman suggesting that the first time since the war started that the leader in Ukraine left the country, you're suggesting it's a coincidence that he ended up in the United States speaking on this very House from that dais right there on the night before the 4,155-page omnibus passed with billions upon tens of billions in funding for his country was included. Are you suggesting that that wasn't just a coincidence?
I am suggesting that it was in no way, shape, or form a coincidence. I am suggesting that it was purposeful theater designed very specifically to create the winds and the sails of the appropriation process, which is badly broken, and you get a 4,100-page bill dropped on us that you then must vote for, right? Have to vote for it.
We don't want to shut the government down right before Christmas, Chip. You don't want that can never happen, which is why my good friend from Texas, the gentleman from Texas, suggests that this is a setup. The CR, the continuing resolution, because we don't pass budgets, because we don't complete our appropriations process, so we don't know what we're going to fund. So the continuing resolution has to keep going, and we do it right into December, right before Christmas, knowing like this has never happened before. But we know that, guess what? People that come to Washington, D.C. from around the country, you know what they'd like to do, Mr. Roy from Texas? They would like to go home to see their families on Christmas. But the only way they're going to be allowed to do it is if they vote for whatever in that bill, whatever is in that bill. And they can object or whatever, but they know if it doesn't pass, if the 4,100-page bill with $1.7 trillion loaded up with earmarks doesn't pass, what happens then? Well, you just have to stay during Christmas. And oh my goodness, just like you said, the gentleman from the 28th Infantry Division fighting in Bastogne, fighting to save Bastogne before the 101st could get there, they spent their Christmas away from home. This is all designed. This is all designed to get exactly what we got. This is broken. And the leadership here in the House and the Senate has done nothing to change this trajectory. It cannot continue.
I would add that my 13-year-old son was telling me yesterday morning while I was getting ready to catch the plane to come to Washington as we were stacking firewood for my wife and daughter and my son to use during this cold snap coming into Texas. And he and I were talking. He said, well, Dad, basically begging me, you're going to be home for Christmas, right? And he's my 13-year-old son, and I don't get to see him a lot when I'm up here. And he's saying, Dad, you're going to be here for Christmas, right? And my daughter was saying the same thing, but my son was asking the question. And I said, look, son, I hope so. Of course, I want to be here for Christmas. But under no circumstances am I going to walk away from my duty to fight to give you the country that I inherited, that my dad inherited from his dad, and so forth and so forth. And yet, most of my colleagues in this chamber were so itching to be able to get on their plane or get in their car and go home that last night there was a group that were apoplectic that we might be stuck here, till Sunday, which is Christmas Day. Had multiple people come and say, well, what is Senator Lee going to do? What's going to happen? Well, heaven forbid we do our job. Heaven forbid we do something responsibly. And I would ask the gentleman, with a $118 billion increase in spending on our annual year-over-year spending, not including the Ukraine spending, not including the disaster relief spending, the emergency spending, on top of the almost $5 trillion we spent in response to COVID, do you think there's a correlation to government action and government spending to inflation? Would the gentleman agree that it is government that causes inflation based on our actions, our spending, our policy choices?
So the Federal Reserve, the good gentleman from Texas, the Federal Reserve is trying to cool down the fires of overinflated, overheated economy by raising the interest rates, targeting the housing market, new folks, new home buyers that are hoping to get out there and start their life in their new home. They can cut their purchases in half or whatever because they can't afford it. Federal Reserve's trying to cool down this overheated economy, inflationary pressures in food and gasoline and oil, electricity, housing. Meanwhile, the House of Representatives and the Senate and the presidency here in Washington, D.C. are throwing the gasoline on the fire, the gasoline of unaccounted for money, unprinted money, untaxed money, just creating money out of thin air and throwing it onto the fire. I would agree with the gentleman from Texas. I would tell him as well that my daughters, my wife and I, our daughters would like their father to be home for Christmas too. My daughter texted me today and said, when she knew I wasn't coming home yet, she said, "Stay strong and save America." So me and Mr. Roy, the gentleman from Texas, we're going to stay here to the bitter end and do our duty. And we're going to say things like $4.2 million in earmarks for parking spaces in the Northern Mariana Islands, or $6 million to expand the reach of the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library might be important things. But can we afford them? What is the federal responsibility? And oh, by the way, regarding the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library, look, I'm a fan. But the lady that offered that, her party is in favor of tearing down the statue of Ulysses S. Grant in New York, the great emancipator, right? The guy that carried out Lincoln's order to make sure that slaves were no longer held in the United States of America. But you know, you can't tear it down on one hand and then spend $6 million on it on the other hand. Well, people are struggling to buy their Christmas presents or their Christmas meals. I yield to the gentleman from Texas.
I assume the gentleman would agree that when we're talking about this spending, let's pause for a second. Let's just set aside the fact that we're giving a $76 billion increase to a Defense Department which has not been held accountable for its departure from Afghanistan, leaving billions behind, walking away from Bagram, undermining our interests, no accountability, no review of the woke policies, the, orders not to use terms like mom and dad at the Air Force Academy, or a whole story yesterday about the Marines maybe walking away from the use of sir and ma'am. Like the just fundamental undermining of the culture of the Department of Defense, purposeful, by the way, which every recruit, every member of the Armed Forces active duty that I talk to says it's gutting the ability to recruit, it's gutting the ability to have strong morale. Let's put aside that. Let's put aside $45 billion for Ukraine without accountability and a knowledge of how it's being spent and what it's being used for in our national security interests. Let's set aside $40 billion for disaster relief. I don't even know where all it's going. Let's set aside the $16 billion of earmarks you just talked about and that you and I outlined. Let's set aside the $3 billion for DHS with no policy changes, and in fact language inserted in the bill that prevents us from actually securing the border while processing more people. The $600 million for the FBI, the new headquarters for the FBI, the $215 million for ATF, the $2.5 billion for the NIH, which has been basically at war with freedom and forcing needles into the arm of the American people and undermining the freedom of the American people in terms of their health choices and paying Anthony Fauci's salary, a CDC of $760 million, the World Health Organization, the State Department of $3.6 billion, an education department which is administering Biden's $400 billion student loan bailout. All of that stuff, let's ignore all of that. Let's ignore all of those horrible policies, all the things that it's doing to undermine our freedom and creating the alphabet soup and expanding the alphabet soup of bureaucracy that is tyrannizing the American people. Let's put all that aside. We're just talking about inflation, and we're spending more money and dumping more money while we're raising interest rates to cool it. We're going to spend more money, causing more inflation, undermining the dollar even more. And you had Mitch McConnell just saying in July of 2022, a few years back, Republican policies created the best economy for American workers in a generation. Low inflation, robust growth, record unemployment. Democrats' recklessness, he said, has produced soaring inflation, slowing growth, and growing risk of a full-on recession. How about Shelley Moore Capito from West Virginia in August of 2022 in an op-ed, thumping the lectern about the Inflation Reduction Act. Quote, Americans understand pumping hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy and raising taxes will certainly not reduce inflation. How about Todd Young from Indiana, quote, about the border, this is a national security crisis, we must strengthen our border security. How about Mitt Romney from Utah, told Mayorkas he needed to secure the border and urged him to keep Title 42 in place and just worked against the whole effort today by the junior senator from Utah. Things are upside down, and we're spending money we don't have, causing inflation, and Republicans go out and campaign against it, and then they do it. And my Democratic colleagues have never once had an honest conversation on the floor of this House about what we're going to do about inflation, what we're going to do about spending money we don't have, racking up debt. When I came to Congress as a staffer on the Senate Judiciary Committee, our national debt in 2003 was about $6 trillion, I think. And we're at $31.4 trillion and climbing. The question here is, are we going to do anything about it? And the resounding answer from this body, and including my colleagues on this side of the aisle, are no, we're not. So I think my question for the gentleman is, does he share my belief that it is time to end the status quo and it is time for a radical departure from the way we are doing things? It is a time to change the way we are doing business in the House of Representatives. It is a time for a change to do the way we're doing business in the United States Senate, and that it is our job to keep our heads up high as not conservatives, not Republicans or Democrats, but as Americans who want to actually do the hard work necessary to be responsible stewards of this country, of our great birthright. Does the gentleman agree with me that as we head into the 118th Congress, and as Republicans are in the majority, that we must fundamentally change this institution from top to bottom, from the leadership down? This place must change, and that we will not accept anything but change. That's why we were sent here. And that as we exit here for Christmas, as you go home to your daughters, as I go home to my son and my daughter, that I'm not going to look them in the eye and say that I didn't do everything I know how to do to change this place so that we can save America for them.
I agree with the gentleman with this caveat. It's not just time, it is long past time. I would suggest to the good gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, that you have worked diligently in your time here within the system, within the status quo, to make these changes, to not make too many ripples because, you know, you have to work with these folks and this is a system that's set up and, you know, if you make everybody mad at you, how are you going to be effective, right? The status quo is not working, ladies and gentlemen. We have tried. We have tried to work within the system that's here. The system that's here produces this. You know how I know? Because since I've been here, this isn't the first time I've come to the mic. I can come here probably every few months and go through the same thing. It's not the first time. Right around Christmas, we got a short-term continuing resolution right before Christmas so we could pass an omnibus and just keep on spending the money that we don't have and more programs that don't make any sense. We got $2.997, that's $3 million for the University of Maine system to research wild blackberry production for changing markets and climates. Well, oh my goodness, as a guy who grew up and I had to pick blueberries, that was my first job, was picking fruit, and blueberries is one of them. I don't know why it's the job of the whole country to pay for the University of Maine to figure out about blueberry production. Ladies and gentlemen, this system is broken. The status quo doesn't work for Americans. The lady that's got to buy these blueberries that can't afford them doesn't care about this system here. Doesn't care about the status quo and making colleagues uncomfortable in this chamber or the other one. What she cares about is feeding her children, feeding her family, and right now she can't afford to do it because of the status quo. This cannot continue. Something has to change. Einstein said doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome is the definition of insanity. Well, ladies and gentlemen, citizens of America, we're doing the same things under the same conditions with the same people, and somehow we think something's going to change. Well, it's not going to change unless we change it. And we're highlighting this tonight. The gentleman from Texas and I are here highlighting this tonight to tell you how egregious it is, how long it's been going on, and to elicit your support, calling your representatives and your senators and saying this will not stand. We are sick and tired of this. $2.52 million for an electric battery and electric charging station program at some community college. $6.85 million for real estate strategy to obtain equity property acquisition and redevelopment in Delaware. Why is that your job to pay for that? We don't have the money to pay for that. You would like it in your community, I bet, but you're going to pay for it in someone else's. I yield to the gentleman from Texas.
I know the gentleman, actually, can I inquire the Speaker how much time we have left?
The gentleman's time has expired.
Oh. Well, Merry Christmas to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, and Merry Christmas to the staff here. God bless you all, and thank you for all the work you do for this country.